Well, hello everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the book of First Corinthians. So, I've provided this video and some notes in the description section that includes what we're going to be talking about today and an outline for you to use as you read the book of First Corinthians. So, the book of First Corinthians is, both books, First and Second Corinthians, if you combine those two, that makes up the longest amount of material that Paul has given us, and I think that's kind of interesting. Also, if you have known anything about First Corinthians, it is the most confused congregation or group of congregations that Paul addresses. And so there's lots of things for us to learn and to apply in our lives from a group of Christians who were recently saved, still quite worldly, and a bit confused by things. And Paul leads them through and corrects them gently with this. So it's good for us to first talk about the city of Corinth. And so the city of Corinth was the largest the largest city in first century Greece. It was a Roman capital of Achaia. Most of the shipping went through this city, and so there's lots of ports. So anything going to or from Rome would pass through Corinth. That's kind of interesting. There's also an interesting side note that there's a small strip of land between the two seas on either side of Corinth. And so what they used to do in the olden days, before there were canals or something, they used to drag ships. They used to unload all the cargo from the ships and transport it over just about a couple hundred miles, and or less than 100 miles, and then they would drag the ships across the land and then fill them up again. And by doing that, they would save themselves time, and they would also save themselves the potential of storms affecting shipping. Kind of interesting. The official language was Latin, but the common language was Greek, and so there's two different languages being spoken about there. In Paul's day, there were about 700,000 people in this city. 2/3 of them were slaves, so there's lots of slaves there. But also there's a large population of freedmen, those that used to be slaves but became free, usually by purchasing their freedom. Corinth was a metropolis city that was worse than LA, New York, and Las Vegas. It was Sin City. It was famous for immorality and paganism. It had 6 temples, 26 sacred places, 33 bars, and over 1,000 consecrated temple prostitutes. So as a way of worshiping some of their idols, they would visit these prostitutes, both male and female. So to act like a Corinthian was synonymous with doing immoral things. That's the church he's addressing. The congregation that he's talking to, that's what they used to be. So, also something interesting about 1st and 2nd Corinthians is that there were a total of 5 letters written back and forth from Paul to Corinth, from Corinth to Paul, back and forth. And so it's good for us to see the order in which those letters happened. So, as I mentioned, 5 letters were written in total. We have letters 3 and letters 5. That's what we call 1st and 2nd Corinthians. So let's briefly talk about what those letters were. So, the first letter is the initial letter Paul sent to Corinth after his first visit and during his second missionary journey. This is now lost, but 1 Corinthians 5:9 implies that there was a previous letter already sent. Letter number 2 is a letter from the Corinthians to Paul. It's from the household of Chloe, which is mentioned in 1 Corinthians. And letter number 3 is Paul's response to that letter that Chloe sent. And that's what we call 1 Corinthians. It was written in Ephesus, delivered by Timothy. And after this, Paul makes a brief, painful visit to Corinth. And this visit is inferred from 2 Corinthians. I gave you the references there. So we believe that he made a short trip to this location after writing 1 Corinthians, and after you've read it, you can see there's lots of issues there for him to address. So letter number 4 is a letter from Paul to the Corinthians after that visit, And in 2 Corinthians chapters 2 and 7, it refers to a painful letter. So we believe that he wrote an additional letter, marked a painful letter, to the congregation in Corinth. And Titus delivers this letter. He then returns to Paul, who is now in Macedonia on his third missionary journey, and reports to him the good news of the repentance of the church. And so as a result of that good news of repentance, Paul responds with that good report from Titus and writes what we have as 2 Corinthians. So, lots of correspondence going back and forth between this church and Paul. So, let's get into some things that you'll be reading about. And so I provided you an outline. I've taken this outline from a book called Talk Through the Bible. It's a book that has great insights and outlines. I use most of their outlines usually. So this book is divided into two sections. Part one is in response to reports that Paul has heard about the church. He's going to address something. And then part two is in response to the letter he received from the household of Chloe and the issues that she or they brought up, he then addresses. So, in response to reports, he hears that there's reports of divisions and quarrels and strife among the church. And so he addresses this. And by addressing this, he tells them that they are misunderstanding the gospel message. They misunderstand the gospel messengers. So they're starting to say, well, I follow Paul, I follow Apollo, I follow Jesus, I follow. They were talking about allegiances, who they're going to follow. And Paul has to remind them, well, you really misunderstand what the gospel actually is. And you misunderstand the messengers. We are just servants of God. And they misunderstand Paul's ministry. So Paul goes through this and explains this to them. Part number 3, immorality and litigations. So there is some sexual immorality going on in the church. There's lots going on in the culture around them. So I guess it's not surprising that some has wound up in the church as well. And they are involved in lawsuits, bringing another church member before the pagan courts to settle their issues. And Paul says you should settle them yourselves and don't bring them before the courts because that brings a really bad name to Jesus and his followers. So the next section, in response to the report or the letter that he received, they had some questions about marriage. And so he addresses that. And you can see this because he's saying, concerning this, I say this. Then probably the biggest section in 1 Corinthians is his talk concerning things sacrificed to idols. Now this is a really lengthy and confusing section, and so I'd encourage you to read it slowly and read it with these divisions. So he makes some general remarks about idols and food, a big deal, a big issue for them in first century Middle East. And then he specifies 3 locations. Food sacrificed to idols. Is it okay to eat meat sacrificed to the god Athena or whoever? And so he lists out 3 locations. Well, concerning food, concerning you dining at the table at the temple of that particular god, he says something. What about buying it, the second location, what about buying that same meat at the meat market? What do you do about that? Third location is if you're invited to a person's house and they serve you that meat, what are you supposed to do with it? So 3 locations, he gives 3 different answers to the same question about food or things sacrificed to idols. Section number 6, concerning public worship. 3 topics here: women in worship, the Lord's Supper, or the understanding and misuse of it, and then understanding how to exercise gifts in the arena of public worship and what they're supposed to do when they meet together. Section number 7 is chapter 15, concerning the resurrection. It's a great message about the importance of the resurrection, and the beginning portion of that is believed to be a creed that the church had, that Paul received from the disciples himself, that dates back to really close to the resurrection. Section number 8, wrapping it up in chapter 16, there was a collection that was going on. He was collecting money to distribute to the poor, to different people. And so he talks about the collection. And then he gives some concluding remarks, as he does with all of his letters, usually something personal. The last section I gave to you were 2 websites you can go to, 2 YouTube pages that had lots of videos to give you insight into the land of Corinth, and a great lecture series by a man named Gordon Fee giving lectures on 1 Corinthians, which I think is fantastic. So, I hope you enjoy reading this book. If you have any questions, please call me or email me or text me. Okay, see you later.